Question 8 of Prima Secunda of the Summa Theologia is about the will in regard to what it wills. There's only 3 articles in this question, so it's pretty short. This is part of the Treatise on Human Acts, Acts Peculiar to Man. And just don't ever forget that the whole purpose of the Summa is Exodus Reditus. Okay, we depart from God, we go back to God. God pulls us back to himself. But some creatures don't have choice, they don't have volition, they just act according exactly as the universal cause dictates, and God just brings them to their end without any kind of free choice. And that's almost every creature in the world other than the angels and the human beings. But to some creatures like us and the angels, God has given free will, and that means we have volition, we have choice, which means we can depart from at least the secondary causes. We can never depart from the universal cause, but we can mess up and we can choose to go against God, choose lesser goods as opposed to the big good. And so the will as a human faculty is very, very important, because that is the intellectual appetite. That is what we are, the part of our body that is desiring the good. And so Thomas in these articles is going to make a distinction between the will and the means to that desire for the end, which is choice. And of course, choice is a big word in our culture today, and I think people need to understand what St. Thomas Aquinas means by choice as it relates to will and happiness and the overall good. Okay, he's never going to actually talk about choice specifically here. He will later on in the Summa, but it's going to certainly be implied in these articles. So Article 1 says whether the will is of good only. Now, this is a very, very fundamental teaching in the Summa, because we only will the good. Okay, otherwise, why would we desire something if it wasn't good? And I think most people don't understand that. They think that some people just desire really bad, evil things. Well, even the evil things that they desire have some aspect of good, because otherwise they wouldn't desire it in the first place. So he says the will is a rational appetite. Now, every appetite is only of something good. The reason of this is that the appetite is nothing else than an inclination of a person desirous of a thing toward that thing. Now, every inclination is of something alike and suitable to the thing inclined, since therefore everything, inasmuch as it is being in substance, is a good. Remember when we learned about that, when it was the aspect of good, and before talking about the goodness of God, when going over his attributes, it was goodness in general, and how everything in the world, if it has being, is good. And I said back then, and I'll say it again, it speaks of Thomas's optimism as a philosopher, as a theologian, that things are good. And that's what sometimes makes life tricky, is that we have a lot of choices between good things, but some are not the best thing. And when we choose a lesser good, we fall into trouble. So he says, since therefore everything inasmuch as it is being in substance is a good, it must needs be that every inclination is to something good. And hence it is that the philosopher says that the good is that which all desire. Everybody wants the good. Ultimately, everybody wants God. But it must be noted that since every inclination results from a form, the natural appetite results from a form existing in the nature of things, while the sensitive appetite, as also the intellective or rational appetite, which is the will, which we call the will, follows from an apprehended form. Okay, the intellect apprehends something, it knows what it is, it knows the aspect of the good, and then the will desires it intellectually. Therefore, just as the natural appetite tends to good existing in a thing, so the animal or voluntary appetite tends to a good which is apprehended. Consequently, in order that the will tend to anything, it is requisite not that this be good in very truth, but that it be apprehended as good. Wherefore the philosopher says the end is a good or an apparent good. All right, so sometimes the good may not be the ultimate good, but it's good in some aspect, but there would have been a better choice to choose on our way to the ultimate good. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Article 2, whether volition is of the end only or also of the means. Now, when he's talking about the means, he's talking about choice. He's talking about all these intermediate things that we have on our way to the ultimate good, and there are a lot of different choices that we have. He says the word voluntas sometimes designates the power of the will, sometimes its act. Accordingly, if we speak of the will as a power, thus it extends both to the end and to the means. For every power extends to those things in which it may be considered the aspect of the object of that power in any way whatever. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense, is that there's the ultimate good, and then there are the choices that we have to make to get there. And it's not always that we're directed only to we're indirectly always guided to the final good, but we have all these intermediary goods and choices that we make which lead us ultimately to that final good, if that makes sense. Thus, the sight extends to all things whatsoever that are in any way colored. Now, the aspect of good, which is the object of the power of the will, may be found not only in the end, but also in the means to that end. If, however, we speak of the will in regard to its act, then properly speaking, volition is of the end only, because every act denominated from a power designates the simple act of that power. Thus, to understand designates the simple act of understanding. Now, the simple act of a power is referred to that which is in itself the object of that power. But that which is good and willed in itself is the end. So what he's doing here is he's comparing the intellect and the will, which is very common with Aquinas because these are the two faculties of our higher part of our soul, right? The intellect is guided to the true, and then the will is guided to the good, right? So, and the good, the true, the beautiful, it's God ultimately, but there's all these these means on the way to that, and that's, again, like I said, that's what gets us into trouble because we choose lesser goods. Wherefore, volition, properly speaking, is of the end itself. On the other hand, the means are good and willed, not in themselves, but as referred to the end. Wherefore, the will is directed to them only insofar as it is directed to the end. So, not getting into too much of the weeds here, but when we talk about choice in our culture today, as it is often held up as a great virtue to, be pro-choice, well, you got to ask, what am I choosing? That's why you got to define the terms. What are you choosing? And is that conducive to the overall good? And I think if you know where I'm going with this, it's not, because it's not a good choice that is conducive to a good end. So that what it wills in them is the end. Thus, wherefore the will is directed to them only insofar as it is directed to the end, so that what it wills in them is the end. Thus, to understand is properly directed to things that are known in themselves, that is, the first principles, but we do not speak of understanding with regard to things known through first principles, except insofar as we see the principles in those things. For in morals, the end is what principles are in speculative science. Again, comparing intellect and will, first principles would be those principles that guide all the knowledge that we have, and that's like the ultimate, just like the ultimate good is going to guide the choices or the means that we use to get to the ultimate end. All right. So Article 3, whether the will is moved by the same act to the end and to the means, okay? Is it the same act, the means, and the ultimate end? He says, since the end is willed in itself, whereas the means as such are only willed for the end, it is evident that the will can be moved to the end without being moved to the means, whereas it cannot be moved to the means as such unless it be moved to the end. Interesting. Accordingly, the will is moved to the end in two ways. First, to the end absolutely and in itself. Secondly, as the reason for willing the means. Hence, it is evident that the will is moved by one and the same movement to the end as the reason for willing the means and to the means themselves. But it is another act whereby the will is moved to the end absolutely. And sometimes this act precedes the other in time. For example, when a man first wills to have health and afterwards, deliberating by what means to be healed, wills to send for a doctor to heal him. Okay, so his will for health was the will for an end, and then the means only came subsequently. The same happens in regards to the intellect. For at first a man understands the principles in themselves, but afterwards he understands them in conclusions, inasmuch as he assents to the conclusions and account of the principles. All right, so I don't know if I did a great job in explaining this, but the bottom line here is he's talking about the ultimate good that we will, and then the means to that ultimate good, which are the choices, the means on the way to getting there. And he did a lot of comparison with the intellect and first principles and those things that we come to know that are means to the fundamental understanding of first principles. Okay, so it's a little bit complicated, but take out of this that our will is always directed to the good, and the means ideally are going to be choices that we make that are in alignment with that ultimate good. That ultimate good is God, and so all the choices we make on a daily basis ultimately are going to unite us with our final end, which is God. Okay, I hope that made sense. That's been question 8 of the Summa Theologia. Thanks for joining me. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us.